Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're all having a positive Sabbath wherever you're hearing this message. Well, brethren, last time we started a two-part series on the 70 weeks prophecy. And as I mentioned last time, in my experience growing up in the Church of God, what more often than not happens when we talk about the 70 weeks prophecy is we tend to jump right into the 70 weeks and how the math plays out, and particularly focusing on how that proves that Christ is the Messiah. And that is very much something that can be proven from the 70 weeks prophecy. But oftentimes when we look at it, we don't oftentimes take a step back and place it all in the historical context in which it happened. Because as I explained last time, the 70 weeks prophecy is delivered to Daniel in response to a prayer that he made to God. And to really understand all the details of the 70 weeks prophecy that we'll actually look at today, you have to understand that whole historical context as to why Daniel was making the prayer that he made in the first place. And you also have to focus on the details of the prayer that he made. Because as I pointed out last time, in his prayer, he doesn't say anything about the Messiah in the prayer that he's making. He's specifically just referring to, the restoration of Jerusalem, and he's appealing to God's mercy and forgiveness, for Israel's sins, so that the people of Judah can be restored back to the area of Jerusalem. That's his focus. Well, today we're going to pick up on kind of where we left off last time, and today we're going to focus more on the details of the prophecy itself. So if you'd like a title for this sermon, it's the 70 Weeks Prophecy Part 2. Again, the 70 Weeks Prophecy Part 2, because I mentioned we're going to kind of pick up from where we left off last time. And just to start off with, we're going to review a little bit of what we covered last time, just to set off the context here. But if you missed the first sermon, you'll probably want to go back and listen to that to get all the details that I'm only going to skim over today. But to start off with, again, let's start again where we did last time, in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 1, because it kind of sets off again the context of the prayer that Daniel made. It says, in the first year of Darius, son of Assyrius, of the lineage of the Medes, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by the books of the number of years specified by the word of Jehovah, given through Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. Now, as I explained last time, it's important to understand what he was referring to there. And I'll just briefly summarize it today because we covered it in great detail last time. But as I mentioned last time, in Jeremiah chapter 25, Jeremiah gives a prophecy basically foretelling the Babylonian captivity that would come on the kingdom of Judah. And as he explains in that chapter, God had warned, that the people of Judah numerous times, as he typically does in these cases, that the people need to repent of their sins, and there's calamity coming upon them if they don't. And typical of God's track record, he gives them multiple warnings and gives them time to repent, and they don't. So as a result, they're then taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar into Babylon, and they're actually removed from the land. And they're basically all exiled from there. And as we saw, as we look through all the details, including how the story plays out in 2 Chronicles and such, it tells us specifically that they would be removed from the land for a full period of 70 years. It even mentioned to us that this was tied to the land Sabbath, that this was going to allow the land to rest for all the years that they didn't allow the land to rest previously because of their disobedience. And as I explained last time, the Bible doesn't explicitly state this, but if you do the math, that if you're making up for 70 years of land Sabbaths that the people didn't allow the land to have because they weren't following God's instructions on the land Sabbath, well, that adds up to a period of 490 years, which is kind of an interesting number when you consider it in the context of the 70 weeks prophecy. This suggests that there was a period of 490 years where they were disregarding the land Sabbaths. Well, as we saw, that you have this period leading up to the Babylonian captivity, and then there's 70 years that they're kept in captivity by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, as I explained last time, Jeremiah didn't just prophesy that they were going to be taken into captivity for 70 years. He also prophesied that after that period of 70 years had expired, that the Babylonians would be punished for their sins, because they weren't anything to brag about. God used them to punish the southern kingdom of Judah, but the Babylonians had plenty of sins themselves, and then they were then conquered by the Persian Empire. That was part of their punishment that they received. But in Jeremiah chapter 29, Jeremiah prophesies that then there would be a plan after these 70 years for the people to return to the land. And see, Daniel was fully aware of this. That's what these two verses and beginning in Daniel 9 are explaining to us, that Daniel understood all of this. Well, if you put yourself in Daniel's shoes, Daniel, experienced the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. As we know from the book of Daniel, he's taken up to Babylon. He works directly with Nebuchadnezzar. He interprets dreams for Nebuchadnezzar. He sees all of this play out. He then is there to witness the Persian Empire coming in and conquering the Babylonian Empire. So he knows the 70 years have expired here, and now that the Babylonians have received their punishment, as Jeremiah said would happen. Well, you can imagine what he's thinking at that point. Now he's hoping for the return back to the area of Jerusalem. And that's what he prays about. Now, we won't go through this in any detail today. I'll just summarize it. But, last time we kind of read through the prayer that Daniel makes from verse 3 all the way through verse 19 of Daniel 9. And as I pointed out last time, what Daniel is praying about here, he doesn't make any mention of the Messiah at all. Now, again, promises of the Messiah are included in the response he gets, when Gabriel, the angel comes to him and reveals this prophecy to him. That's very much included in the response that he gets. But Daniel was not asking about the Messiah. Daniel was pleading for God's forgiveness for the people of Judah because, he fully admits that, this was a self-inflicted problem. It was because of their disobedience, their rebellion to God, that they were taken into Babylon into captivity. And he's asking for God's forgiveness, and he's specifically, asking for the restoration of Jerusalem, for the people to be able to come back to the city and the city to be, restored, like it previously was. That's his focus. And as you can imagine, as someone who's now a slave in Babylon, who was a slave under Nebuchadnezzar, and he's a slave under the Persian Empire, he's hoping to get released from all of this and return back to Jerusalem. And see, that's his focus of what he prayed about and what he asked. And that's important to understand because, as we're going to see today, as we go through the details of the prophecy, oftentimes, again, we're focused on the math that proves that Christ is the Messiah, and that very much is a part of the 70 weeks prophecy. It does give us a powerful witness that Christ is indeed the Messiah, but there's also other details here that sometimes we skip over or we misinterpret because, again, we're solely focused on the Messiah, and we kind of forget that Daniel wasn't asking about the Messiah. He was focused on the restoration of Jerusalem. And again, that's important to remember as we go through this. But now let's just pick up in verse 20 here, because this is kind of picking up right after Daniel's prayer. And we'll see here that the angel Gabriel is sent to Daniel by God, basically to reveal this prophecy to him as a response to his prayer to God. And this is in Daniel 9 in verse 20. It says, "Now while I was speaking, praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before Jehovah my God for the holy mountain of my God, yes, while I was speaking in prayer, the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision at the beginning, being caused to fly swiftly, reached me about the time of the evening offering. And he informed me and talked with me and said, O Daniel, I have now come forth to give you skill to understand. At the beginning of your supplications, that the command went out, and I have come to tell you, for you are greatly beloved, therefore consider the matter and understand the vision." So again, the prophecy he's about to receive is in a direct response to his prayer. Now again, let's keep in mind, and you'll understand why I keep kind of emphasizing this as we go through all the details here. He wasn't asking about the Messiah. Now, he was asking about, forgiving Israel's sins and appealing for their mercy. And again, that, mercy and forgiveness is very much tied to the sacrifice of Christ. But as we're going to see here, what he was focused on was the restoration of Jerusalem. So we have to keep that in mind as we're going through the details of this prophecy. Now, let's start off now in verse 24. 70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Now, again, this will make sense later in this sermon when we kind of come back to verse 24. But just take note of the fact there's a list of things here mentioned, and the last thing mentioned is anointing the most holy, revealing Christ as the Messiah. Now, again, obviously forgiveness of sin and the mercy, again, that's very much ultimately tied to the sacrifice of Christ. But just keep in mind there's a lot of other things mentioned here, in addition to just revealing that Christ is the Messiah. And that'll make sense as we kind of dig into all the details. Now, first of all, let's focus on this first statement here. 70 weeks are determined. Now, as I mentioned last time, and we'll dig into detail today, this is referring to a period of 490 years. But how do we know it's 490 years and not 490 days? Because if you take it very literally, if it's 70 weeks and, times 7, that would be 490. But if, again, you're just counting them as days, it would be 490 days. How do we know it's years and it's not literal days? Well, there's multiple reasons for that. First of all, let's look into the Hebrew word here that's translated as weeks in English. Now, the Hebrew word here is transliterated into English as sabua. It's S-A-B-U-A. It's Strong's number 7620. And the definition I'm going to give you comes from the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the Old Testament by Warren Baker and Eugene Carpenter. And here's how they define this word. Quote, a masculine noun meaning 7 a week, a group of 7 days or years. It indicates a unit of 7, a week, 7 days, of a marriage feast, a week of days. It is used in the technical sense to name a festival, the Feast of Weeks. It refers to 7 years, a heptad of years. So see, it can literally mean, literal weeks, a group of 7 days, or again, it can refer to, the weeks as meaning, 7 years, rather than, literally 7 days. So the very meaning of the word does give us a reason to think it could be 490 years. Now, let's also notice that this is also a biblical concept. And what I mean by that is the idea of a day for a year is a concept we find numerous times in the Bible. Now, we'll turn over to Numbers 14 for the first example of this. But let me also suggest if you've got a ribbon in your Bible, you probably want to put it here in Daniel 9, because we're going to come back to this chapter a lot today. But turn over to Numbers chapter 14. And we'll see an obvious example here that utilizes this principle of a day for a year. Now, the story we're going to pick up on here is the story where, Israel has, already made the covenant in Mount Sinai. They've journeyed to the edge of the promised land. They've sent the spies in to spy out the land. But when they come back and give their report, the majority of the spies, 10 of the 12 are basically saying, well, we're all going to die. There's giants in the land. They're all going to kill us and we're all going to die. And Joshua and Caleb are the only ones saying, well, we don't have anything to worry about. We just trust in God. He'll take care of it all for us. Well, as you know, the people all lose faith, and they're basically sentenced to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. And we're going to pick up the account here in verse 26, but what I want you to notice how, again, it specifically mentions this day for a year principle. This is in verse 26 of Numbers 14. It says, Then Jehovah spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation who murmur against me? And I have heard the murmurings which the children of Israel murmur against me. Say to them, as I live, says Jehovah, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will do to you. The carcasses of you who have murmured against me shall fall in the wilderness, all of you who are numbered, according to your entire number, from 20 years old and above. Except for Caleb, this is the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua the son of Nun. You shall by no means enter the land which I swore I would make you dwell in. But your little ones, whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. But as for you, your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, and your sons shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years. And bear the brunt of the infidelity until your carcasses are consumed in the wilderness, according to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days. For each day you shall bear your guilt 1 year, namely 40 years, and you shall know my rejection. I, Jehovah, have spoken this, and I surely will do it to all of this evil congregation who have gathered together against me in the wilderness. They shall be consumed, and there they shall die. So you can see he's clearly illustrating this concept of a day for a year. Now turn over to Ezekiel chapter 4. We'll see another example here. I just want you to see a couple of examples here to see that this is, clearly a biblical concept and not just something that we kind of pulled out of nowhere. This is Ezekiel 4 in verse 1. And you also, son of man, take a clay tablet and lay it before you, and portray on it a city, Jerusalem. Lay siege against it. Build a siege wall against it, and heap up a mound against it. So set camps against it also, and place a battering rams against it all around. Moreover, take for yourself an iron plate, and set it on iron wall between you and the city. Set your face against it, and it shall be besieged, and you shall lay siege against it, and there will be a sign to the house of Israel. Lie on your left side, and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it. According to the number of days that you lie on it, you shall bear your iniquity. For I have laid on you years of your iniquity, according to the number of days, 390 days, so you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. In verse 6, and when you have completed them, lie again to your right side, and you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have laid upon you a day for each year. So notice it's very clearly showing us that the Bible, repeatedly uses this concept of a day for a year. Well, see, if we take this into consideration, and again, also the meaning of the Hebrew word used there in Daniel 9:24, and as we're going to see, also just apply it as the Bible tells us, because we're going to see in the next verse, it lays out that this, period of 69 of these weeks, 483 years, it's got to connect us from a command that's given, that's associated with the restoration of Israel, and it's got to connect us with the Messiah. Well, if we use this as 483 days, we couldn't get anything like that to work. But we're going to see if we apply it as 483 years, that's definitely going to connect us, which kind of seals up the subject here. So now turn back over to Daniel chapter 9, and we'll pick up in the next verse here. Daniel 9, and now we're going to pick up in verse 25. It says, know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. Now, as I mentioned here, the math here has got to work out from a command and then connecting us with the Messiah. Now, if we did 483 days, we couldn't get anything to connect, but we're going to see 483 years actually works. Now, as I explained last time in a lot more detail, we can't just look at any particular decree that's associated, with Jerusalem, the people, returning, from the Persian, captivity there, down to the area of Jerusalem, because there's multiple. As you discovered last time, there are decrees in Ezra chapter 1 and in Ezra chapter 6 that are made by Persian kings. But as we talked about last time, those decrees are specifically focused on rebuilding the temple. They really don't speak to anything on a broader scale than that. They're really just associated, with rebuilding a building. In addition, as we saw, if we look at the dates and then try to apply 483 years, they don't even get us to any point in Christ's, physical life. So they don't connect us with the Messiah. And we kind of covered some of the signs here in this verse that to define what decree we're looking at. But just for a review, we're going to look at this again today. Now, again, the clues that this verse gives us is that this command is, as it says, to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, if we look at the meaning of the Hebrew words here, the meaning of the Hebrew word for build means what you would assume it means. Basically, it's constructing something. However, if we dig into the word restore, it gives us a little more, to work with here. Now, the Hebrew word here that's translated as restore in English, it's transliterated. The Hebrew word is transliterated into English as sub, S-U-B. It's Strong's number 7725. And again, the definition I'm going to give you is from Baker and Carpenter, the Complete Word Study Dictionary of the Old Testament. And they define this word as, quote, a verb meaning to turn, to return, to go back, to do again, to change, to withdraw, to bring back, to reestablish, to be returned, to bring back, to take, to restore, to recompense, to answer, to hinder. Now, see, as you can see from all those definitions, it can have some broad meaning, but if we place this into the context here, obviously what's meant by this is the concept of reestablishing or restoring. And so this is referring to the city of Jerusalem. We're talking about more than just building a single building of the temple. We're talking about restoring Jerusalem to some meaningful sense of what it was previously. And this is further supported if we look at another statement here, a little further down in verse 25. It mentions, the street shall be built again and the wall. And again, if you look at the Hebrew here, as we discussed last time, the Hebrew word there for the wall is pretty straightforward there. You probably are familiar with Nehemiah's wall, and it's recovered. It's discussed in the book of Nehemiah, where he tells the story of him going back to build the wall. However, the word there for street, when we think of that in English, when we think of the word street, what comes to our minds is the paved strip that we drive our car on. Now, this Hebrew word can have that type of meaning. However, it can have a much broader meaning, and that's more helpful in this context. Now, the Hebrew word here that's translated as street, the transliteration of this Hebrew word into English is rehob. It's R-E-H-O-B. It's Strong's number 7339. And Baker and Carpenter define it like this. A feminine noun referring to a street, a public square, an open place. It uniformly indicates an open area, a plaza, a public square of a town or village where most people met. Nearly all cities had such an area. Wisdom cries out to the people in the town square, a public place. It refers to the entire network of open areas and streets in some cases. It would be a feature included in a rebuilt Jerusalem. As I mentioned last time, that last statement there is specifically referring to this verse, that this would be included in the rebuilt Jerusalem. So obviously what we're looking for, is a decree associated with rebuilding Jerusalem, but again has a broader context, and an application than just rebuilding the temple, just a single building. Now again, turn over to Ezra chapter 7. Again, we won't go through all the details of this decree like we did last time, But just to set us off on the right track here, turn over to Ezra 7. And we're going to see here this decree that sends Ezra back to the area of Jerusalem is speaking much broader than rebuilding the temple. Because by the time that this occurs, the temple has already been, fully rebuilt and even dedicated. But let's notice here that this decree that is given to Ezra is speaking to the area of Judah and Jerusalem, and it's speaking to establishing a governmental structure, establishing the law of God back in this area. So it's about restoring the area back to, kind of what it was previously. And that's what, Daniel 9 is referring to. So pick up here in Ezra chapter 7 and verse 11. Said, now this is the copy of the letter that King Artaxerxes gave Ezra the priest, the scribe, expert in the words of the commandments of Jehovah and his statutes to Israel. And Artaxerxes, king of kings, to Ezra the priest, a scribe of the law of God of heaven, perfect peace and so forth. I issue a decree to all those of the people of Israel and the priests and Levites in my realm, who volunteer to go up to Jerusalem may go with you. And whereas you are being sent by the king and his 7 counselors to inquire concerning Judah and Jerusalem with regard to the law of your God, which is in your hand. I notice he says this is about Judah and Jerusalem. It's about restoring, the government of your God, of his law in this area. He's talking about establishing a governmental structure, kind of restoring the area to what it had previously been. And now we're going to skip over a lot of this because we read through a lot of, all the details of this decree last time. But jump down to verse 25. And pick up here, it says, and you, Ezra, according to your God-given wisdom, set magistrates and judges who may judge all the people who are in the region beyond the river, all such as know the laws of your God, and teach those who do not know them. And whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily on him, whether it be to death or banishment or confiscation of goods or imprisonment. See, we're talking about, again, reestablishing a governmental structure here that follows the law of God, that tries to enforce that and govern the area, by this law. We're talking about restoring Jerusalem like it previously was, is what this is referring to here. And see, this very much ties to exactly what Daniel 9 is talking about. But notice it also talked about the rebuilding of the wall. Now, again, this decree doesn't specifically mention that. That's mentioned in more detail in the book of Nehemiah, where Nehemiah is sent down specifically to build the wall. But let's notice that Ezra, in his comments in chapter 9, indicates that his understanding was this was a part of, this was included in the overall mission that he was sent to accomplish. Because pick up here in verse 9. Now, the context of chapter 9 is Ezra dealing with a problem of intermarriage, among the people. In other words, the people of Israel, they're having intermarried with the pagan nations around them, which we know back from, that Moses' writings had been forbidden all along, because God always told them not to do this because it would pull their hearts away and they'd start, worshiping pagan gods. And he's trying to address that issue, but let's notice a comment he makes here in verse 9. For we were slaves, yet our God did not forsake us in our bondage, but he extended mercy to us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to revive us, to repair the house of our God, to rebuild its ruins, and to give us a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. Notice we haven't even gotten to the book of Nehemiah here. Nehemiah hasn't been sent down yet. But Ezra's already saying, we're going to build a wall here. He's obviously thinking this is included in the instructions that he's been given, that this is part of the overall picture. So my point here is this matches what we read in Daniel chapter 9 of the decree we should be looking for. in addition to that, we're going to see the math works out as well. Because this decree in Ezra 7 is dated as occurring in 457 BC. Now, as I mentioned before, if we take the day for a year principle, and we remember that what Daniel 9 tells us is 7 and 62, which is going to add up to 69, and then we multiply that by 7, and we assume a day for a year principle, what we get is 483 years. Now, if we take 457 BC and we subtract 483 years from that, and we account for the fact that when you go from BC to AD, there's not a year 0, and you account for that, where you land is 27 AD, which just so happens to be the year that Christ's ministry began. So what we have is from the going out of the command until Messiah the Prince. See, the math works. And see, this is another detail that solidifies for us that we're not talking about 483 days, we're talking about 483 years here. So obviously the day for a year principle is what we're looking at. But again, as I mentioned, in not only last time, but in the introduction to this sermon, oftentimes we just kind of focus in on the details of this that prove that Christ is the Messiah. And as we've just seen, that is very much a part of the 70 weeks prophecy. But let's also keep in mind, it didn't just say 69, it said 7 and 62. Now, why make this distinction, and what is this about? Now, again, let's keep in mind what Daniel prayed about to begin with. Now, as I mentioned, I emphasized a lot more detail last time because we read through, every word of Daniel's prayer. And as you'll notice, if you go through that, he doesn't say a single word about the Messiah. He's not inquiring about the Messiah. He doesn't mention the Messiah. That's just not included at all. What he's referring to, he's asking about the restoration of Jerusalem and the people being sent back there and Jerusalem becoming, kind of what it was previously of God's capital city and it being restored into a meaningful, version of that. That's what he's focused upon. And what we're going to see here is that's what this prophecy attaches that first division of the 69 weeks into, because it talks about 7 and then 62. So just to notice this, turn back over to Daniel chapter 9. And notice that it breaks this down. It doesn't just give us, the big picture of 69. It talks about 7 and 62. And we're going to try to understand why does it break that apart. It's in verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublesome times. Now notice, the only thing that it attaches any of this to is, again, the rebuilding of Jerusalem and its restoration. Now, what we're about to see here is from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, we can document over half of this, this 49-year period, just from direct statements that are made here, that are actually made in these two books. And what we're going to see here is those first 49 years obviously focus on restoring Jerusalem and the rebuilding of it. Now, if you look in history, if you do the math, that first 49 years, that brings us to 408 BC. Now, there's not really a specific event that took place in 408 BC. There's not like some monumental event that we can tie this to and attach it. But again, if we just look at the details of the prophecy here, the only thing it can point us to is, again, the rebuilding of Jerusalem and this being established. And we can document from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah a large chunk of this period. And just to see that, turn back over to Ezra chapter 7. Because what we're going to notice here is through the Old Testament, you'll see this a lot, where time is measured, in various kingdoms by the such and such a year of the reign of this king, and they'll use that as benchmarks to measure time. Now, notice this in Ezra 7 and verse 7. It says, and some of the children of Israel, the priests, the Levites, the singers, the gatekeepers, and Nehemiah came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. And Ezra came to Jerusalem in the 5th month, which was in the 7th year of the king. Now see, we can use this to measure time. Now, as I mentioned before, this is 457 BC when this took place. This is when Ezra received this decree. Now let's turn over to Nehemiah chapter 2. And we'll notice here when Nehemiah is sent, to basically rebuild the wall, it gives us a time reference with this as well. And we're going to see here, we've got 13 years of that first 49 years now that we can account for. Let's pick up here in Nehemiah 2 and verse 1. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Now notice that the reference we just read was the 7th year of King Artaxerxes. This is the 20th year. So now we've had 13 years have expired between these verses. And continuing in verse 1, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. And now I have never been sad in his presence before. And therefore the king said to me, why is your face sad, since you are not sick? There is nothing but sorrow of heart. Then I became dreadfully afraid, and said to the king, may the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies waste, and its gates are burned with fire? And then the king said to me, what do you request? So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, I ask that you send me to Judah, to the city of the father's tombs, that I may rebuild it. So see, this is what results in Nehemiah going back to the area of Jerusalem to try to build up the wall. And this occurred in 454 BC. Again, we're 13 years into that first 49 years. Now, if we turn to Nehemiah 13, we'll see another benchmark date that it gives us here. This is in Nehemiah 13, and we'll pick up here in verse 6. But during all of this, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, the king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Then after certain days, I obtained leave from the king. Now, if you pay attention to the details here, what it's referring to here is there was a point where he leaves Jerusalem, goes back to the king, and then some time goes by, and then he returns. Now the benchmark date it gave us is when he returned to Jerusalem is what it just gave us. It doesn't tell us exactly how long he was there and how long he waited to return. Now pick up in verse 7. And I came to Jerusalem and discovered that the evil Eliashib had done for Tobiah in preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. And it grieved me bitterly. Therefore I threw all the household goods of Tobiah out of the house of the room. And I commanded them to cleanse the rooms, and I brought back into them the articles of the house of God, and the grain offering and the frankincense. And I also realized that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for each of the Levites and the singers who did work had gone back to his field. So I continued with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? And I gathered them together and sent them in their place. So see, the benchmark date it gave us is when Nehemiah left Jerusalem and went back to the king. Doesn't tell us exactly how long he stayed there with the king before he returns again and then takes more action. But the date that it gave us, it basically gives us down to 432 BC. See, now we're 25 years into this 49-year period. This is why I was saying you can document a lot of these years as building on the restoration of Jerusalem. Now, the book of Nehemiah, is as far as when it was written, is typically dated around 430 BC. In other words, about 2 years later. So my point here is we can show more than half of this time, is documented, throughout the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. So obviously, these first 49 years are division of the rebuilding and restoring of Jerusalem. But then it gives us the 62, the rest of this time frame that connects us with the Messiah. But also realize another thing that's not directly stated, but if you just think about it, is kind of obvious. There were lots of prophecies made previously of the Messiah would have to fulfill. Prophecies in the Old Testament that Christ fulfilled in his ministry. And these laid out that Christ was going to be in the area of Jerusalem when all of these events took place. Well, obviously, there had to be a restoration of the area. There had to be the rebuilding of the temple. All of this had to take place for these prophecies to be fulfilled, for Christ to do the things that he did and to fulfill all of them. So there's an obvious connection between all of these, and you can see why he would then break down the first 49 years, the restoration of Jerusalem, and the rest of the 62 is again the time from there until the Christ ministry starts. But now let's turn back over to Daniel chapter 9 and continue on with the prophecy here. Because as we noticed here, the first 69 weeks or 483 years bridges us from the decree of Artaxerxes that Ezra received to go back and kind of restore a governmental structure and restore the city of Jerusalem. It bridges us from there all the way to Christ beginning his ministry. But now let's notice here in verse 26, what it tells us happens after that. And after 62 weeks, in other words, the second half of this, Messiah shall be cut off. Now, if you're reading a New King James like I am, a Nelson New King James here, there's a one next to be cut off. And you'll notice in the margin, it says suffer the death penalty. Well, if you read the next phrase here, you can see that totally fits. Because it says Messiah shall be cut off, but not for himself. Well, what happened after Christ fulfills his ministry and he's cut off, he's killed, he's sacrificed for all of us, but he didn't die for himself. He died to be the sacrifice for all of us. That's obviously what this is getting at. But now let's notice here that the rest of the prophecy then focuses more on this last week. And then we're going to kind of go through the debates about what this last week is about and see really what this is telling us here. Now, pick up here in the next sentence here. It says, and the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with a flood. Till the end of the war, desolations are determined. Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offerings. And on the wing of abominations shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, when you're interpreting this final week, there's oftentimes two major theories associated with how to apply this last week. And oftentimes the debate around this centers on the word he in verse 27. Now, what I'm about to show you is that's really not something to focus how to interpret this and to use as the basis for a debate, because technically the word he, if we look at the Hebrew here, is really not in this verse. Now, you could debate in terms of translating from one language to another, because languages are sometimes structured differently, and they don't just say the exact same thing with different words. Sometimes there's a whole different structure and way of expressing yourself from one language to another. And now you can debate whether inserting the word he, kind of makes it make more sense in English. But what I want you to see, first of all, is that technically the word he is not actually there. Because if you'll notice in verse 27, now I'm reading from the New King James here. These first four words, then he shall confirm. It's four words in English. It's one word in Hebrew. And if you look it up in an interlinear, you'll see, technically the Hebrew word for he, it's just not there. It's assumed and it's inserted by translators. That's also true with the latter part of this first section of the verse, where it says, he shall bring an end. Again, that's five words in English. It's one word in Hebrew. Now, just to illustrate how this kind of reads if it's translated more literally, I'm going to read to you the first part of this verse and a couple translations that again translate it more literally there, and the word he is not there. The first one I'm going to read from here is the Septuagint, and this is again the first part of Daniel 9:27. It translates it as, "And 1 week shall establish the covenant with many, and in the midst of the week my sacrifice and drink offering shall be taken away." Now notice it's focusing on this covenant or agreement that's made here. It doesn't really have the word he there. This is also true of how the Bible in Basic English translates this. And again, this is also Daniel 9:27, the first section here from the Bible in Basic English. It says, "And a strong order will be sent out against the great number for 1 week. And for half of the week, the offering and the meal of offering will come to an end." So what I want you to notice here is, again, the word he, if we're technical about it, it's just not actually there in the Hebrew. Now you could argue as to whether, again, that makes it, more understandable in English, and if it's appropriate in translating from one language to another to put it there, maybe the case, but it's not actually there. Now what I want you to see here is, let's take a closer look at probably the most common argument that I've heard all of my life growing up in the Church of God to explain verse 27 and the final week of the prophecy. Because the traditional argument that I have heard most all of my life is that the first half of the week here, that's referring to Christ's ministry. And they're saying that, well, he's confirming a covenant. Well, he's confirming the new covenant. He's basically, that's his ministry proclaiming that. And the focus there is because it says in the middle of the week, you're bringing an end to sacrifice and offering. Well, we know the book of Hebrews talks about, Christ's sacrifice, replacing the sacrificial system. But let's make sure that we're applying this concept the way the Bible actually teaches it. And the reason I mention that is because oftentimes, the way that this gets put across in the Church of God has kind of an obvious logical disconnect with it as to how we oftentimes approach this concept. Because what I've heard taught most of my life growing up in the Church of God, it's kind of the idea that, well, when once Christ died, then sacrificial system is just completely done, goes away, doesn't apply in any concept whatsoever, and it's as of the moment that Christ died. Well, let's just make some obvious observations that everybody agrees upon and see the logical disconnect with this. Because did the sacrifices immediately stop when Christ died? No, they continued on for 40 years, and they stopped in 70 AD when the temple was destroyed. That's just historically what we all know happened, and everyone agrees on it. We also know the sacrifices are reinstituted before Christ's return because prophecy tells us about them being stopped. And so they have to start again for them to be stopped. We also know, because there's a stack of scriptures that say this, that they're going to be in force during the millennium. So this idea that, well, from the moment Christ died, that they just don't apply in any way, shape, or form and are completely done away with, there's some major logical problems with that. It doesn't really apply like that. Because to properly understand it, we have to realize that, yes, Christ's sacrifice replaces the sacrificial system, but that comes into effect when the new covenant is offered to particular human beings. That's really where the issue is relevant. And to see that, let's turn over to Hebrews chapter 10. It's Hebrews chapter 10. Let's notice here, because it is going to explain what we've taught all of my life, that yes, Christ's sacrifice replaces the sacrificial system, but let's make sure, again, we're applying the concept the way the Bible teaches it. Because again, we can just look back at history, and again, what we even know about the future, because the Bible explicitly states it, that it's not an issue of, well, Christ died and there's no more sacrifices, they're completely done and never come back. That's really not the case. Because what the relevant issue here is when the new covenant is offered to human beings. Because as we know, currently today, the new covenant's only offered to the first fruits. It's not offered to the rest of mankind until the 8th day period, as Christ himself said in John 7. That's when he said everyone could come to him and receive the Holy Spirit. But let's notice here in Hebrews 10 in verse 1. For the law having a shadow of good things to come, not the very image of the things, can never with those same sacrifices which they offer continually year by year, make those who approach perfect. For then they would not have ceased to be offered. For the worshippers, once purged, would have had no more consciousness of sin. For if those sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sins. Therefore, when he came into the world, he said, Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sacrifices for sins you had no pleasure. Then I said, Behold, I have come. In the volume of the book it is written of me, to do your will, O God. Previously saying, Sacrifice and offering, burnt offering and offerings for sins you did not desire, nor had pleasure in them, which are offered according to the law. Then he said, Behold, I have come to do your will, O God. He takes away the first, that he may establish the second. Now notice here, and again, you'll understand in a minute why I'm focusing on this detail. It does talk about Christ's sacrifice and that taking away the old covenant, but what is it replaced with? It's replaced with the new covenant. That's going to become very important here in a minute. And in verse 10, by that we will have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands ministering daily, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But this man, after he had offered one sacrifice for sin, forever sat down at the right hand of God, from that time waiting till his enemies were made his footstools. For by one offering he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also witnesses for us, for after he had said before, This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, says Jehovah. I will put my laws in their hearts, and in their minds I will write them. And he adds, Their sins and their lawless deeds I will remember no more. For where there is remission of these, there is no longer an offering for sin. So notice, when is it that sacrifices stop? When there's forgiveness of sin, when the new covenant is being offered. See, that explains why there are sacrifices that take place during the 1,000-year millennium. Now, I won't get into further detail discussing that subject. I did a sermon for the Feast of Tabernacles last year entitled, Why Will There Be Sacrifices During the Millennium? And if you look at that particular sermon, it explains that subject in much more detail. But what I want you to notice here is when it talks about Christ's sacrifice taking away the sacrificial system, what is it replaced with? It's replaced with the new covenant. Now, with that in mind, turn back over to Daniel chapter 9. Because now we're going to dig into the wording of verse 27 and notice something very interesting here. Now, I'm just going to read through verse 27 again from the New King James here, and then we're going to look at some other translations. This is Daniel 9, verse 27. It said, Then he shall confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he shall bring an end to sacrifice and offering. And on the wing of abomination shall be one who makes desolate, even until the consummation which is determined is poured out on the desolate. Now, when you read the second half of that verse in the New King James, it's a little vague, and you're not sure how to connect that with the first part of the verse. But now, if we read this in how several other translations, in fact, we're going to read 5 different translations here that consistently paint the same picture and how it translates the second half of the verse. And what we're going to see here is it connects the second half of the verse directly with what's mentioned in the first half. In other words, it doesn't just talk about the ending of the sacrificial system, of the sacrifices at the time, I should say. It talks about what it's replaced with. And it's not talking about replacing it with a new covenant. Now, to start off with, this is Daniel 9:27, just the second half of the verse. This is from the New Revised Standard Version. It says, "And in their place shall be an abomination that desolates until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator." I notice what this translation is saying is that it's not just that there's an end to sacrifice and offering, it's those sacrifices are replaced with the abomination of desolation. That's not something the sacrifice of Christ does. Now, let me read to you also the second half of verse 27 from the New International Version, and you'll see that this agrees. "And at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him." Now let me share with you the second half of this verse from the Septuagint. You'll see that this agrees as well. "And on the temple shall be an abomination of desolation, and at the end of time an end shall be put to the desolation." Now the second half of verse 27 from the New Living Translation. "And as a climax to all his evil deeds, he will set up a sacrilegious object that causes desecration, until the fate decreed for this defiler is finally poured out on him." Now the second half of verse 27 from the Bible in Basic English. Notice that these are all painting the same picture. "And in its place will be an unclean thing causing fear, till the destruction which has been fixed is let loose on him who has made waste." I notice they're all painting a picture that it's not just that there is an end, in the middle of the week, an end brought to sacrifice and offering. The sacrifice and offering, the sacrifices that were performed at the temple in the end time, they're replaced by something, and it's replaced by the abomination of desolation. That's obviously not referring to something accomplished by the sacrifice of Christ. This does, however, directly match what Daniel 12 tells us. Now turn over to Daniel chapter 12, and we'll pick up in verse 8. And you'll see as we read through this is obviously referring to events at the end time. "Although I heard, I did not understand. Then I said, My Lord, what shall be the end of these things? And he said, Go your way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many will be purified, made white, and refined. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. And from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away, and the abomination of desolation is set up." Notice it's referring to sacrifices taken away and replaced with the abomination of desolation. This matches exactly what we read in Daniel 9:27. And continuing on the verse, "There shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and comes to the 1,335 days. But you go your way to the end, for you shall rest and will arise to your inheritance at the end of the days." Now, Daniel obviously rises to his inheritance at the resurrection of the first fruits, the blowing of the seventh trumpet. And so that tells us, the end point for all these countdown of days that are laid out here. We won't go into those in detail, but that just kind of tells you that they all have a same stopping point, and that stopping point is the resurrection. But notice here how it spoke of the end time, and it specifically talked about sacrifices being stopped, but replaced by the abomination of desolation. And we read 5 translations of Daniel 9:27 that ended the verse talking about, the sacrifices that are brought to an end, They're replaced by the abomination of desolation. Now, there's a historical fulfillment of this as well, of the abomination of desolation, and this is in Daniel 11. Now, we're going to pick up in Daniel 11 in verse 29. It says, "And at the appointed time he shall return and go toward the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus shall come against him, and therefore he shall be grieved and return in rage against the holy covenant and do damage. So he shall return and show regard for those who forsake the holy covenant. And the forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress, and they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation." Now, it's widely agreed upon that verse 31 there was historically fulfilled by Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, he was, basically a leader of the Seleucid kingdom, which was a division of Alexander the Great's, Greco-Macedonian Empire. As you know, that basically, conquered the Persian Empire, and then it, basically busts up into several segments. And then all of Daniel 9 is the king of the north and the king of the south, battling it out with each other. But again, that's historical fulfillment here was Antiochus Epiphanes, basically going into the temple, stopping the sacrifices there. And then he sets up an idol, there, and basically gets idolatrous worship, taking place in God's temple is what takes place. And that's actually even tied to the meaning of the word abomination that's used in all of these verses here. It's used not only in the examples we read here in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12, it's also the word used in Daniel 9, when it was referring to the abomination here that's replacing the sacrifices that are stopped. Now, I want to share with you the meaning of the Hebrew word here, because you can see it directly ties to idolatry. It's transliterated into English as sikus, it's Siqqus, and Strong's number 8251. And again, the definition I'm going to give you is coming from Baker and Carpenter. They define it as, quote, a masculine noun meaning a detestable thing, an abomination, and an idol. This Hebrew word identifies an object that is abhorrent or blasphemous. It is used to denote filth, forbidden food, blasphemous activity. Most often it is used as a synonym for an idol or idolatry. Now, there's a reason why I kind of point out this specific detail. Because you're probably familiar with the fact that in the Olivet prophecy, Christ mentions the abomination of desolation several times. And he directly tells us if you want to understand what the abomination of desolation is, you need to look at Daniel the prophet. He specifically says, look at Daniel the prophet. And we've just looked at Daniel. We know how Daniel defines it. And so turn over to Matthew 24. We'll see a couple references here. And you'll understand in a minute why I'm emphasizing how Christ told us to interpret it. It's Matthew 24, and we'll start in verse 15. It says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand." And then what did Christ tell us? If you want to understand it, you're going to have to look at Daniel. You'll understand in a minute why I'm emphasizing that. And in verse 16, "Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not come down or take anything out of the house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. For when there shall be great tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of the world, nor ever shall be." So you can see he's very clearly speaking about the end time here. Now turn over to Mark chapter 14. We'll notice the parallel account here, where Christ makes very similar comments. So Mark chapter 13. And we'll pick up in verse 14. It So, but when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let the reader understand. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not go down to the house, nor enter or take anything out of the house. And let him who is in the field not go back and get his garment. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing in those days, and pray that your flight may not be in winter. For in those days will be tribulation, such as not been since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, nor ever shall be. And unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened those days. I notice again, once again, we're very obviously referring to the end time. Now, as I mentioned both times when we read through Christ's reference to the abomination of desolation, I pointed out the fact that he said, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. He made it very clear, if you want to understand what I'm talking about here, you need to look at Daniel. Now, the reason I point that out is I remember growing up as a child in the Church of God. And one of the concepts I've heard taught repeatedly, was taught at Ambassador College, is they would speak about the abomination of desolation. And they would note these two accounts here of the Olivet prophecy. But then they would use the explanation for what the abomination of desolation is, and they turn to Luke 21 to give the answer. Now, turn over to Luke 21, and we'll notice here that, again, this is a parallel account of the Olivet prophecy. But again, it doesn't tell us directly that he's defining the abomination of desolation. And take note of the fact that we're getting an answer from Luke the physician, not Daniel the prophet. So notice here in Luke 21 and verse 20. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Now, what would happen is that they would look at this and say, well, armies cause desolation, so that must be the army surrounding Jerusalem, that must be the abomination of desolation. I never considered the fact that, maybe this is another event that also connects with all of the events that Christ is describing, but Christ didn't say, if you want to understand it, turn to Luke the physician. He said Daniel the prophet. Well, if we look in Daniel, and again, the very meaning of the words used, it's stopping the sacrifices and setting up idolatry in the temple of God is what it's referring to here. Because, see, if we turn to 2 Thessalonians, we have another verse that even directly tells us here that we're not just going to have sacrifices in the end time, we're going to have a rebuilt temple that's going to take place. It's 2 Thessalonians in chapter 2, and we'll start reading in verse 1. It said, now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and the gathering together of him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled either by the Spirit or by word or by letter, as if it was from us, as though the day of Christ has come. Let no one deceive you that by any means, that the day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So this is telling you, at the end time, the false prophet, the beast here are actually going to be in the temple, proclaiming themselves to be worshipped here. This is idolatry. Setting up anything with anything in our lives, that we put more important to God is idolatry. Certainly an individual putting themselves up above God is the most blatant idolatry that there is. See, this is the abomination of desolation referred to here. But let's also notice how the end of Daniel 9:27, how it's worded a little more clearly, in the New Revised Standard Version. Now, again, I'm going to read to you the second half of this verse again, but let's notice how the very end of it is stated. It says, and in their place shall be an abomination that desolates until the decreed end is poured out upon the desolator. See, if we understand now what this final week is referring to here, obviously it's some type of treaty or agreement, that's made with, the beast power affecting Jerusalem. And in the middle of this week, they renege upon this. They attack the area. They stop the sacrifices, and they set up, the abomination of desolation. Well, the desolator, is obviously the individuals who led this effort, who brought this about. And the decreed end of the desolator is described for us in Revelation 19. But notice this also has the 70 weeks prophecy, not just connecting with the first coming of the Messiah, but the second coming of the Messiah. This is Revelation 19 in verse 11. And then I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he who sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and righteousness he judges and makes war. His eyes were like a flame of fire, and his head were many crowns. And he had a name written that no one knew except himself. And he was clothed with a robe dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies in heaven, clothed in fine linen, white and clean, followed him on white horses. And out of the mouth goes a sharp sword, and with it he should strike the nations. And he himself will rule them with a rod of iron, and he treads the winepress, the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God. And he has on his robe and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the birds that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather together for the supper of the great God, that you may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of the mighty men, and the flesh of the horsemen, and those who sit upon them, and the flesh of the people, the free and slave, both small and great. And I saw the beast of the kings of the earth, and their armies gathered together to make war against him. And he sat on the horse and against his army. And then the beast was captured with him, and the false prophet, who worked signs in the presence by which those who received the mark of the beast and who worshipped his image. And the two were cast alive in the lake of fire and brimstone. This is the end of the desolator. In verse 21, and the rest were killed with the sword, which proceeds from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. So this is the prophesied end of the desolator. So you can see the 70 weeks prophecy, if we think through all the details, doesn't just connect us with the first coming of the Messiah. It also, the very end of it, connects us with the second coming of the Messiah. But you might remember when we first read verse 24, I said we're going to come back to, all that list of details they gave us that all preceded, basically anointing the most holy, which revealing Christ. But now let's just read to you that verse in the New Living Translation. And a period of 70 sets of 7 has been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish their rebellion, to put an end to their sin, to atone for their guilt, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to confirm the prophetic vision, and to anoint the most holy. And notice how that's worded of the rebellion of the people, because this was what? About the holy city. Well, what was Daniel praying about? The restoration of Jerusalem, for the people of Judah to be able to send back there. And it was 70 weeks for all of this to end and to wrap up, and then to restore righteousness and restoring Jerusalem. Well, think about this. After the end of the desolator, as verse 27, of Daniel 9 told us, that's Christ returning and throwing them in the lake of fire. What happens next? It's the setting up of the millennium, isn't it? And what happens in the millennium? Jerusalem is restored as the capital city of the world. Turn over to Isaiah chapter 2. We'll just briefly look at a couple of verses here that show us the ultimate fulfillment here of the restoration of Jerusalem. Remember, it was 70 weeks for that to happen. And that last week, those last 7 years, are right up at the end time. This is Isaiah chapter 2. And we'll start in verse 1. And the word of Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of Jehovah's house shall be established at the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come and let us go up to the mountain of Jehovah, to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and he shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of Jehovah from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between the nations, and shall rebuke many people. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall he learn war any more. And if we turn over to Zechariah chapter 14, we'll see a similar prophecy, again telling us how Jerusalem is restored now as a capital city of the world, and it's living in obedience to God and righteousness. It's Zechariah 14 and verse 16. And it shall come to pass that everyone who is left of all the nations which came against Jerusalem shall go up from year to year to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And it shall be whichever of the families of the earth do not come up to Jerusalem to worship the King, Jehovah of hosts, upon them, there shall be no rain. And if the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. And they shall receive the plague which Jehovah strikes the nations, who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. And this shall be the punishment of Egypt, and the punishment of the nations that do not just come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. In that day, holiness to Jehovah shall be engraved on the bills of the horses, and the parts of the Lord's house shall be in the bowls after the altar. Yes, every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holiness to Jehovah of hosts, and everyone who sacrifices shall come and take them and cook in them. And in that day there shall no longer be a Canaanite in the house of Jehovah of hosts. As I mentioned from the outset of this series, Daniel's prayer focused on the restoration of Jerusalem. Now that very much involved the Messiah. He wasn't asking about the Messiah, but again, the prophecy does include the Messiah, but not just his first coming, also his second coming, because the ultimate restoration of Jerusalem is in the millennium. Because you see, that's what that last week is applying to. We've oftentimes thought in the Church of God that we're in the middle of that last week, but as we saw here, the way that Christ brings an end to sacrificing is replacing it with a new covenant, not with the abomination of desolation. But the beast power at the end time, they will stop the sacrifices and replace it with the abomination of desolation. But when the end is brought about on the desolator, that's Christ returning and setting up the millennium. So what we can see is those 70 weeks truly take us all the way to the ultimate fulfillment of the restoration of Jerusalem.